I'm Jeff Doan from the Adult Education Council. I lead the Social Justice and Ethical Issues pillar, and we are delighted to have two other members of our council who are the presenters this morning. Last week, we had a very fascinating and challenging talk by Joe Morrow, one of our associate pastors, as he looked at memory and reminding and repair is one way to think about that, framing the whole issue of the hidden roots of white supremacy theologically in terms of our beliefs. This morning, we have Justin Myers, who is a journalist and also a very serious researcher. After we started talking this week, he dove into the archives of Fourth Church because of a question that I was raising. So he's already on top of that. And we're also delighted to have Regan Burke, who is a longtime political activist, I think would be her self-definition. When I did a Zoom call with her this week, she was sitting in the passenger seat of a car in Wisconsin preparing to knock on doors. So that's called substance behind that. And she is also an avid researcher. And when Brad Hunt was here for Cornerstones, he credited them with some of the research that he has relied on in terms of seeing all the racial covenants and the real estate covenants, which is what we will hear about this morning. And as I keep trying to get the very excellent title of this course in my tongue, I'm going to let them share it with you. But this takes us back to the years of Harrison Ray Anderson, who was actually pastor here from 1928 to 1961. So he has the longest term of any of the pastors up to the present. Maybe we'll have another longer one, but who knows? Let us begin with a word of prayer. Loving and just God, we thank you for this chance to gather. As we do so, we renew our friendships within this community of adult education. And as we heard from Tom, that is a crucial spiritual gift and discipline. May we renew that this morning. Help us face our past and learn from it that we might not have to repeat it. Be in our presence, we pray. Be with Justin and Regan as they lead us this morning. All this we pray in our brother and our friend Jesus. Amen.
Thanks, Jerry. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Regan Burke. I'm not Justin Myers. I just want to thank you, Jeff Doan, for your continuing leadership, especially in the area of anti-racism work, which is a passion of mine and Justin Myers. Also, I want to thank the Adult Education Council for allowing Justin and me, lay people in the church, uncredentialed, to express our passion for the opportunity to end racism. Harry Emerson Fosdick, a mid-century or 20th century pastor and theologian, in the midst of his own journey to end racism, penned these words. Thank you, Ted Otto. God of grace and God of glory, on your people pour your power. Crown your ancient church's story. Bring its bud to glorious flower. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour, for the facing of this hour. Historical investigations often lead to uncomfortable truths. facts that some people would rather leave buried in the past. Yet the sins of racism and of racist white dominant systems persist and continue cycles of oppression. The Fourth Presbyterian Church Chicago congregation gathers together to state our values on lands that have been stewarded by the ancestors and descendants of tribal nations who have lived here on the shores of Lake Michigan since time immemorial. We recognize that our church is built on property that through an illegal auction by the US government in 1849 forcibly removed indigenous people from our church land, their homeland. We give honor and praise to our land ancestors, the Potawatomi Nation, who nurtured and protected our lands, waters, and animals before our white ancestors settled here. We celebrate all Indigenous people who call Chicago home, their traditional teachings, and their lifeways. Built on stolen land with donations from fortunes amassed from the stolen wealth of chattel slavery, Fourth Presbyterian Church seeks to remember, repent, and repair historical harms as it strives for a beloved community. Truth-telling aims to unearth historic and systemic racial injustices. Reckoning aims to publicly own and name harms and injustices. And discernment is coming to a collective, agreed upon definition of what constitutes healing and repair. Let us pledge to one another to actively identify and oppose racism in all its forms through truth-telling, reckoning, and discernment. Let us commit to building a beloved community. As Black families migrated from the Jim Crow South in the early part of the 20th century, white neighborhoods in Chicago devised 3 different schemes to keep Black people from residing in their communities. Close to a third of Chicago neighborhoods were given an official D grade and marked red on a map by the federal government, thus redlined. These areas, all of which were predominantly Black communities, were deemed undesirable, and residents from these neighborhoods were usually denied mortgages and insurance, severely limiting Black families the privilege of home ownership, a critical element of generational wealth. The second official housing practice was to sell property to Black people through contracts, in which Black buyers were deceived into believing their contract installment payments would lead to home ownership. It didn't. Racially restrictive covenants were the third most common official quasi-legal way to discriminate against Black people in the Chicago housing market. These were stipulations written into deeds of sale that prohibited Black residents and sometimes Jews and other non-whites from buying, leasing, or inhabiting property. Black servants were allowed to live in garages and basements. This is all described in the WTTW documentary, The Shame of Chicago, that was presented in a Cornerstones talk recently by Brad Hunt. In Robert P. Jones's White Too Long, he describes that in the late 1940s Los Angeles, Reverend W. Clarence Wright, the pastor of Wilshire Presbyterian Church, headed the fight to keep the Wilshire district all white. When an African-American war veteran moved into the neighborhood, the Reverend Wright personally sued to evict him. Wright lost the case. The courts held that racially restrictive housing covenants were unconstitutional. But racially restrictive covenants remained common practice in cities across the country until they were finally struck down nationally by the Supreme Court in the Shelley versus Kramer case in 1948. In this landmark case, whites attempted to prevent a Black couple, J.D. and Ethel Shelley, from buying a house in a St. Louis neighborhood. This was not the Deep South. The Shelleys were challenged in court by a white neighbor, Louis Kramer, who said the original deed to the house specified that, quote, no people of the Negro or Mongolian race could purchase the house. The Supreme Court sided with the Shelleys. This case was a turning point in dismantling decades of segregational practices, not only by the federal, state, and local governments, but also by developers, real estate agencies, and neighborhood organizations. It was argued and won by NAACP attorney and future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall in a 6-0 vote. Why 6-0 and not 9, which are the number of Supreme Court justices? Because 3 of the justices had to recuse themselves after finding that their own houses had racial restrictive covenants. Racial restrictive covenants in the Shelley neighborhood in St. Louis had been organized by the Marcus Avenue Improvement Association, a white homeowners association that was sponsored by the Cote Brillante Presbyterian Church of St. Louis. Kramer's excuse me, legal attempt to evict the Shelleys was funded from the church coffers, an action officially proved by the congregation's trustees. You can see that Presbyterian churches actively pursued attempts to keep Black families out of their church neighborhoods. And again, this was not the Deep South. In The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, Richard Rothstein explains that the FHA and the VA required writing racial restrictive covenants into deeds that banned selling or reselling to Black people before they would issue mortgages to white buyers. This happened before and after World War II until Shelley versus Kramer in 1948. Housing developments like Ringwood, a huge publicly funded suburb in Richmond, California, and the sprawling Levittowns of New York and New Jersey had FHA and VA racially restrictive covenants. Justin Myers and I discovered a 1933 racial restrictive covenant in the basement of City Hall with the help of the Chicago Covenants Project. The 1933 Near North Racial Restrictive Covenant was signed by property owners in the area bounded by North Avenue, Lake Michigan, the Chicago River, and Wells Street. Rather than individual deed restrictions attached to each property, the Near North Racial Restrictive Covenant is connected to and includes over 300 deeds. It's one of the largest racially restrictive covenants and most cynical ever uncovered. The covenant states that to have a property removed from the racial restrictions, there would have to be signatures from over 75% of the property owners. For instance, if property owner and signatory, Robert H. McCormick, one of the, who is a Fourth Presbyterian member, if he had changed his mind and wanted to remove the racial restrictive covenant from his property, say around 1940, he would have had to go door to door and convince about 250 of his Gold Coast neighbors to have Black neighbors. Justin will now present the racial history of Ford's Presbyterian Church. Justin.
Thank you, Regan. Gonna back us up a bit here to start out. I'm gonna give a few more acknowledgements. Maura Finley of the Chicago Covenants Project, who made this all possible and was really the spark that ignited our search for it. Pastor Stuart Barnes Jameson, president or pastor of the uh, Westminster Carter Church in Skokie, which we'll talk about later. Janet Love, Kent Stevens for their research help, and Brad Hunt also for research assistance, and to Micah Marty for assistance with the church archives. Also to the Chicago History Museum for allowing us to access their portfolio of Fourth Church history. Right, get through this. So we went down to the archives of City Hall. At that time, we were not really thinking, well, the possibility, of course, is there in this racial restrictive covenant that's the size of a phone book. It's that thick. And this operated as the equivalent of today's HOA, where everyone signed on, and in order to get this removed, everyone would have to sign off. So we opened it up, we flipped through the pages, very hard to find things actually in this, but we found this property on Huron Street, and you can see that the name is the Congregation of Fourth Presbyterian Church. Now, the difficult part about this covenant is that it's composed of two parts. One, the first half is like a telephone directory where it's all the addresses by streets and names of the places neatly laid out. The back half, where you would find the yellow pages in a phone book, is where all these signatures are that are only identifiable by that property number in the far left, that 23, which means absolutely nothing to the address, but you have to go through, and they don't have this nicely laid out in the back. They just cut and pasted the hand signed strips to the back of the book. So when I say that we finally found it, I will also say that we were very surprised to find that it was not signed by Fourth Presbyterian Church at all. Not to mention it's the wrong address, but by Carter Memorial Presbyterian Church. So this sparked an interest in figuring out why, first off, why are there two different, why did somebody else sign off on our church's property? But also, what is the motivation for what we found was an Assyrian congregation to sign off on a property deed that prohibited people of color from moving into their area? And that's really where we got started. Regan, you got anything to add?
I just want to add that for me, this was like a condemnation, right? Like, we need to reckon with this. For Justin, it was more like, oh no, anybody can come down here and see this and think that Ford's Presbyterian Church is racist. So we're looking at it from two different points of view at the same time, really shocked to see it.
Yeah, and that's anyone, you all tomorrow could go down to City Hall and see our name here. And like I said, it's incredibly hard to see the back. So whether we're going to get into the complicated story of this, but we are listed in this document, even though somebody else signed off. It is not, from the way that they set this up, it is not like we are in this document, even though we weren't the ones who signed. So why is that? And why did somebody else sign off, and why would an Assyrian congregation sign off on an inherently racist document? So we get into the Jazz Age of the Near North Side, which, from the racial restrictive covenant we're talking about today, is defined by North Wells Street on the west, Division Street on the north, Lakeshore Drive on the east, and the Chicago River on the south. We do have properties within this covenant that go outside of these boundaries. I'm going to be honest, I think that they were being a bit desperate to a certain degree. There was a few people who put in clauses that they would only, they're going to sign off, but they're only going to sign off for 5 years unless you get 80% of the owners to sign this document. Then we will permanently put our property on this covenant. This covenant, if you signed off on this covenant, you gave them permission, like an HOA, to take control of your property, to seize it from you, and to lose your mortgage would be seized by the Near North Side Property Owners Association, and you would lose your property if you decided to sell or rent to a person of color. Now, back then, there was the Near North Side and Gold Coast was much different than it is today. There is a huge division west of State Street, east of State Street. West of State Street was what was known then as the slum area. Known for Italian mob attacks with gunfire, bombs, lots of news stories stoking fear about that. That area was affectionately given the name Little Hell. That area was near Goose Island, east of the river. And to give you a bit of a comparison, west of State Street, you could get a family home for a little over $10 a month, but east, you could get, as a single person, an apartment that went for $1,000 a month. These are 1920s figures, but there was concern from the people east of State Street that the undesirable people living west of State Street would start migrating because they did not have enough space west of State Street. And when Black people started moving into the area, it really accelerated that fear because they were like, oh my gosh, all these Black people are moving in. Of course, now even like there's not going to be enough space. Of course there isn't. So what were they afraid of? What was this huge migration? Every red property was a Black residence that is located here. I think there's a few more. Yeah, okay. We got the states here. So there are Black people moving in, but is it really causing the area to swell? And would we really be that concerned about this image if these were a nice blue color or a green color? We might not even look twice, but they give it nice and red for warning to us. So the area is changing in the 1920s. There's the Great Migration happening. People are moving in, and things are starting to change. I'm going to get into a bit of how they interpreted Black people around this time. So when they mean Persians, they mean Assyrian Persians and Syrian Persians. Persia, modern-day Iran at this time, was experiencing a genocide. Lots of them moved to the United States to escape that. So I want to draw the comparisons that white supremacy really was at the root of this issue. Because we see this comparison here where Black people are really just seen as the lowest level of society. And these Sicilians, the Italian mobsters, are seen as being better than them, even though they are the ones in the news with all the issues with crime and these bombs in the area. Even though they're the ones given that stereotype, they're not listed in the covenant. It is only Black people. So very clearly, the motivation for this was anti-Black and solely anti-Black. So then we have this, put this comparison here with the Persians to answer the question of why would they have signed on? Why would people be okay with them staying in the neighborhood and not Black people? And that's just our changing views on, you know, that mindset at that time of racism. A bit about the Assyrian congregation at that time. Fourth Presbyterian Church in the early 20th century was really focused on sponsoring these mission churches, which you think of like a business incubator, you give the business money and you give them space to really start and get started. We did this for churches, and we had several. We had Bohemian and Assyrian were our first two. And with the Assyrian church, we actually had contact with Persia, which is now Iran, with a missionary there who did work there. And they met within our walls. Later on, the Japanese congregation, which you all probably know the best, came along, and that was part of that. Phoebe Carter, a member at Fourth, paid for the Assyrian congregation to have a chapel and community center on Huron to grow their ministry. Now, this is what the property that's listed in the racially restricted covenant refers to. It's this property that Phoebe Carter purchased for the congregation because they were starting to outgrow the space we were able to provide them at Fourth. So the goal with these mission churches never was to keep them in the church, but to really sponsor them as these community centers that could support their people, keep their cultures alive, keep the language alive, and to one day hopefully send them off to be on their own without the reliance on Fourth Church. Like I said, that's Carter Westminster Church today in Skokie. There's mergers, there's movements. They moved to Skokie, I believe in the 1950s, and they're still there today. So that has been a very successful congregation and still is thriving, still has a large Assyrian membership. Now, like I said, we did not technically sign at the time that Carter Memorial Church signed. We had completely divorced them from our session, from our church leadership, sent them completely out on their own. But even though we did not technically sign, we had a lot of decision-making members who did, for example, the McCormicks. So regardless of anything else, we had people in high levels of leadership who were supporting this covenant. This is where 54 West Huron, you can see here this is the church building, this is their community center. The community center had Assyrian businesses in it. It had space for community activities, and this has since been torn down, replaced by condominiums. In the last phase of its life, it was actually turned into a hair salon, which Michelle Obama went to. So very random and strange tie-in, but that's the fun part about research. I want to, though, to give a bit of sympathy to the Assyrian congregation living here, because their motives for signing this document were radically different from the white people who were signing this document to protect their houses. First off, it is West Huron, not East Huron. So we know that it is west of the divide, which is in the bad area, so as they called it back then. Two factors that influenced the signing of this document. For the elite, Black people began migrating to the near north side. As I said, there's fear that they were pushing east. As we saw from that chart, really, we're not talking huge numbers. We're talking about 2 to 3 dozen families moving in, and people being a bit, well, not a bit, but very paranoid about that. Whereas on the other side, Assyrians were facing violence within their own community. Within them, they had a separate divide. Huron Street cut off the Syrian Persians to the north and the Assyrian Persians to the south. Like I said, they were escaping genocide, and a lot of that hatred followed them as they came over to a new country. There was one fight that involved 200 people. It took place in a restaurant. It started to occur because one of the sides crossed the boundary, entered a cafe, and everything broke loose. So within these two groups, boundaries were very important to preserve the safety. And if you are familiar with neighborhoods or have lived in a neighborhood where gangs are prevalent, you will understand how neighborhood boundaries and divides, how that importance really, like just how important that is. And I don't want to compare these two groups, two gangs, completely different, just to make a modern parallel that we have today is streets and understanding where people can go and where people can't, especially when it comes in terms of violence and keeping the peace. That's a different conversation than white people being afraid that their nice, pristine neighborhoods would be tarnished by a single black family moving in. It still does not change the long-term effects and the long-term harm that this caused. But it's a different motivation to why they signed compared to other groups. And a reminder or historical point of clarification is that Middle Easterners at this time were by the census considered white. So that is why they, even though they signed, they were still able to keep their property because they were seen by the law as white. And like I said, different motivations for why they signed compared to the other folks who did. So why was this really? So we can say that, yeah, the white people were racist. Okay, yeah, we can say that simply, but I think to really get into the story, you need to dig into what really motivated people to sign off on this document. Because from today's standards, we can say, oh, well, of course, because like gang violence and drugs, well, they didn't really have that back then with the black communities. There's a whole different form of racism that really sparked this. And most of that racism was really just white people wanting to be white people with what I will get into as the social register. Any questions so far?
Yeah. What's the distinction between the Syrian Persians and the Assyrian Persians?
Thank you. So when the British moved out of that region, the Assyrians, they basically created their own country. So you had the Assyrians who were promised their own country originally, but then the British were like, actually, no, we're going to lump you all in the same country and force you to all try to get along. And of course, that, as we know from other colonial attempts, that doesn't really work. So that's why it was just a dispute over land and identity. So to get into the white side of things, how would someone become popular in the 1930s? A white person. I'm not talking, we're only talking about white people with this because that's all the people who were allowed to be popular back then. Suck up, play the part, show ambition, and impress the man behind the curtain. The Social Register, which is still around today, was first published as a list of the approved elite, began in New York. Chicago wanted its own slice of the pie. The Michigan Avenue Bridge, when that opened up, it was huge for the city. Everyone was like, we can finally travel north more. And the Gold Coast, the near north side, was chosen as what would become the shining symbol of Chicago's new high society. So when the Drake Hotel opened up, they were like, this is great. This is going to be the fortress of the new social elite, the new symbol of us having this high society. And Chicago began to create its own 400 Club, which 400 Club originated in New York City as allegedly the Astros could only fit 400 people in their ballroom. I'm sure you all have that problem. It's hard, I know. But so Chicago wanted to adopt this. I believe there's also like there's other clubs. I think one of them was like the 200 Dancing Men, which were eligible bachelors. You had a lot of lists you could get on. So, and you had a lot of lists you could get on, but no one really knew who could put you on that list or how you could get on that list. So you had to be someone before you got on this list. So you weren't fighting for this because you wanted to elevate your position in society. You did this because you were already someone and you wanted more. You wanted that social greed. You wanted more and to keep going. So an unknown selection process created the published list of names. It could be based on your career. A lot of times it was your personality, your popularity as a bachelor at parties, and more. And with no set of rules, as you can imagine, you did like anything was fair game. It was your best guess as to what would get you on these lists if you wanted to be on this list. There were, for the near north side, the McCormicks were really big leaders in this social scene. We'll get into it later on, but they were one of the few who actually saw the near north side as their home. Around this time, McCormickville was given to their pod of houses they had. Houses, there were mansions, but so there was really this high society that was wanting to be started, but really Chicago did not have the infrastructure, the historical infrastructure to start it that New York City did. So a lot of changes came because of that. And with the social register, there was really dictated where you could or could not go. There was like, read one account where it was like, take the taxi to the opera, but don't you dare take the trolley if it's more than 4 blocks away. And it's just ridiculous stuff to where they really, because there was no defined path, they really just micromanaged every part of their lives to attempt to make it to the top. Including the church, which in the Jazz Age was dead. Like, they were really upset with how much the church had died off. In fact, when we announced our endowment fund in the 20s, it was seen as a desperate sign of our times, that we were so desperate to stay afloat amidst this departure from the church that we would do this worldly thing like start an endowment fund. So the reason we have an endowment fund at this church is because churches were going broke around this time. The social elites, if they did choose a place, they would go to 3 churches listed here, which were the approved churches: St. James, St. Chrysostom's, and our church, Fourth Presbyterian. So again, even though we may not have signed on this document, our church membership catered towards those who were part of this social scene who did sign off on this document due to social pressure and really just the desire to have more, to want more for themselves with complete blindness to anyone else around them. We talk about beloved community being this community where all of God's creation is seen as loved, valued, cherished. This is the antithesis to that, to say that only a select group of 400 people can really experience the full grace and the full bounty, and the rest have to stab each other to even hope to get their foot in the door. I said that the McCormicks were kind of strange for near Northsiders because they were one of the few who really saw this area as home. And we can be thankful for that because they put a lot of funding into the neighborhood. They funded our church. They were really active members in the community. But by and large, most people, they did a survey in the Gold Coast around this time. And most said that the idea of whether this was a community was a bit strange to them because they just moved here because they wanted to elevate themselves in their community. And they really didn't see this as their neighborhood. They saw it as a gateway to the 400 Club. They spent 3 to 5 months out of the year living in country homes or traveling. It was very popular around this time and still to this day reigns pretty true. As an adult ed program, we suspend our programming in the summer because everyone's traveling. So there are some things with this culture that still, for those of us here, reign true. And again, they didn't care about the neighborhood beyond what it could give them. They were somebody who wanted something more. Again, these weren't people at the bottom who wanted to work their way up. In order to be even considered for the social register, you had to not be employed by anyone, meaning that you were owning your own, calling your own shots when it came to business. So you had to prove yourself and you really had to make it in the world before you could even be considered. So these weren't people at the bottom doing what it could take to get themselves a foot in society. These were people who already had a foothold in society wanting more and more. But any questions before I move on with that? I'll walk a microphone over to you.
Did you come across the Nickersons in this review, i.e. the treehouse?
Thank you. When it comes to specific names, I'm going to be honest, we haven't had the time to really sift through that. Just because it is so difficult, there is no alphabetical order, so you have to go address by address. So as we're both busy people, that for specific names, we have very few, but we did pull out some, such as the McCormicks, who were more renowned. Other names are, for example, the Newberry Library. Moody Bible Institute really went ham on signing these things. And yeah, you could really sit down for an afternoon. Like I said, this thing is like the size of a phone book. Yes. And we were able to attain, thanks to Maura Finley and the Chicago Covenants Project, we were able to retain a full PDF copy if anybody is interested on a lazy Saturday afternoon to I mean, we would really appreciate the work, in all honesty. So please, if you're interested, we would be happy. And if you have downtime to commit to that, we would be very happy to share that with you. So this is one of the things that we were really confused about in the church archives, or at least I was. Regan was too. So we have all this going on. We have the community, the church, people in the church and leadership in the church signing off on this document, promising that this area would be forever white. At that time, there was no constitutional battles. Yet, during the time Carter Memorial Church would have been signing this document, they were also fighting to get a black choir to perform at their church. At the same time, well, later on in the decade, Fourth Presbyterian would adopt a series of pro-black racial justice programming. Titled The Negro in America. It took place in the late 1930s. There was a push from the denomination, an educational push, to adopt this as that year's focus for church-wide education all across the country. And a couple of the books they recommended, you can find them online, and they're actually progressive even by today's standards. The language is outdated, the views are a bit dated, but gets into things like the statistics for educational inequities between black communities and white communities. Gets into things like black culture, like, oh, you see, like, we understand why you think black people don't really behave in the North, but that's because they're working with Southern culture. And you need to understand that they are coming from a very different cultural background and be more receptive to that, and to kind of let down your cultural biases and really open your hearts. There was a semester-long classes for women, single women, young women, who at this time we didn't even allow women to be ushers at the church. So these weren't the decision makers in the church receiving this education. It was the women of the church, which still important, but how much of this got to the decision-making bodies of this church, I don't know. I don't know if we can answer that question. We do know that Harrison Ray Anderson wrote against lynchings in the South, celebrated that there was starting to be a downturn in the amount of lynchings in the South. He did this for about a year or two, and we didn't go past in the church records, so I don't know when he stopped, but we did find 1 or 2 years where he was vocal. So we do know at the top level they were at least aware. I don't know the extent of that education for them. And then we also had Race Relations Sunday on Lincoln's birthday, and 4th celebrated the end of slavery, which they seemed as saw as being completely over, and that all the issues were over because of that. And I'll just leave that at that. But this initiative was lost somewhere across the line, and we see this complex struggle of, okay, the denomination is sponsoring this theme for the year, talking about racial justice in America. The church is not sparking that on its own. They're doing what the denomination is telling them to do. I think that's an important clarification to make, because we still have that social pressure of the denomination is telling me to do something, so I will do it. And we're going to jump ahead a bit very quickly to talk about Harrison Ray Anderson, but I just wanted to know, is there any questions about this period of time? I'll walk a mic back.
I was wondering if what was going on in Chicago on the South Shore area, which is really, as I've read, the first place the very wealthy people landed and then migrated or moved up to this North Shore. So was there anything redlining or discriminatory on the South Shore?
I don't have specifics, but I will know that the reason why South Shore began to evolve around this time and people moved north was because of this Michigan Avenue Bridge. So there was, my guess would be yes, that there was stuff. I don't have specifics for you, but we're seeing a period of changing time for the South Shore, especially where there's white migration to the north because they can finally move north across the bridges, and they want to be a part of this high society at the same time. So you'll see, if you go into the archives, a big distinction between the rich families of the south side and the rich families of the north side. But this, I will say that something of this scale, to where there's multiple properties signing off as a community area, is unique really to our area in terms of a national level even. Jeff, would you like to say a bit on, I know you've done more research on Harrison Ray Anderson than I have.
I'll speak briefly and then I want to make sure we get other questions in. I will recommend a book. When I was joining the pastoral staff, I thought I better do a little research. I'd been a pew sitter for 2.5 years in retirement. So the book that I find extremely helpful is authored by one of the former associate pastors, James Wellman, who's now a professor at University of Washington. He did his PhD work with Martin Marty and others at the Divinity School, University of Chicago. The book that Justin's been talking about will echo the title of this book, which is The Gold Coast Church and the Ghetto. Now, that was reflecting the time when we shifted from the very individualistic approach of Harrison Ray Anderson to our next pastor. And Elam Davies was very eager to reach out to the community as a church. And so if you think 60 years of the tutoring program, which began right in Cabrini, that's Elam Davies. That did not begin with Harrison Ray Anderson. When they were talking about this, I thought, we ought to at least have a clue to the nature of the church. Wellman's conclusion is that Black individuals of the time did not feel comfortable, nor were they welcomed on North Michigan Avenue. And part of Anderson's approach was, well, that's the way society is. So I just seek our ministry within society. He was very concerned to visit businessmen, and I will emphasize that, because he thought women had their place and it wasn't in business. This is startling. We just have to know the different episodes of Fourth. When John Timothy Stone asked Harrison Ray Anderson to come as his co-pastor, Anderson insisted on writing the session. By the way, Justin's an active elder on our session. I neglected to say that. And he said, "You need to know that I am very conservative and very evangelical." So he believed the purpose of the church was to convert individuals. And there were these periods, but he was looking mostly to the past, to lynching and slavery's over and it's all good. I can say this very comfortably from a very different era. But I urge you, if you want to get a sense of the pastoral leadership and the culture of the congregation at the time, to get a hold of this book. That just gives you some places to start, and I'll bring a microphone.
Tell us the title again.
That would be fair. Yes. The Gold Coast Church and the Ghetto. And the author is James Wellman, Wellman.
All right, we're going to take a couple questions. I want to very quickly show one slide. Because why does it matter? Why does it matter to talk about the past? And what can we do more with this? We're going to have more programming talking about these eras. Do your part to educate yourself and get involved. The reason why this was able to persist for so long is people only thinking about their own experience in life. If we are to live as God's beloved community, we need to embrace all of those around us. We need to fight the individualistic mindset to really make sure that all feel welcome in the church. And our church does not have any current public anti-racism statement. I would encourage you to reach out to pastors in the session if you feel like you want to support the publishing of one. Because like I said, this document, anyone can walk in, they can see it. They can read about the history. They know the stereotype of the area. We as a church really commit ourselves now to social justice, to racial justice, but there's still these skeletons of our past, which are very much still alive today. This is a living document in City Hall. So with that, I urge you to stay educated, stay involved, and I invite anyone who has any questions to please raise those.
Being older, my mother and father were living through the Depression. And part of the fallout from the Depression, when you didn't know where the next meal was going to come from, was a fear of not fitting in. So there was a lot of fear about conforming. And anybody who grew up in the 50s, remember that as a great time of conforming. And then a rebellion in the 60s away from that and other values that were consistent with what Jeff just said about the change in the church during that time. One of the thoughts that just keeps going through my mind is with the election 9 days away, if, say, Trump wins and the Supreme Court, which says that he's immune, and there is a sense of who wins and who loses, who becomes a part of the in-group, the challenge to this church and all Christian churches will be very relevant. How do we adhere to our faith in a time where doing so may have real costs to us? So I guess it's a comment more than a question.
Yeah, and thank you for that.
I was going to comment just very briefly about the South Side question a few minutes earlier. And I'm a resident of Wisconsin who came to IIT in the late 60s and spent some time on the South Side working and going to school and all that sort of stuff there. And if you recall some of the history of the community on the South Side, Bronzeville was where blacks were pretty much located and segregated within that community. And during the years before and during World War II, a lot of blacks migrated to Chicago and basically began busting out of Bronzeville and moving south and pushing west as well. And that's when a lot of, let's say, segregation issues became evident block by block and that sort of thing. And as some of you might recall, the Dan Ryan Expressway was built specifically with the construction route that it took to enforce and keep segregation barriers as they existed prior to its construction. And of course, then you had the Robert Taylor homes and all that sort of stuff. And then Hyde Park itself became sort of a slum until the University of Chicago rescued it by a lot of capital infusion. But then block by block south of Hyde Park, neighborhoods would move from white to black. And there were these continued push further and further south and also west. And I lived for a while in Bridgeport while I was going to IIT, and I have some horrible, horrible stories that I encountered while I was living there. Just unbelievably.
Thank you, John. I think it's really important to note that Black people had no choice about where they were going to live. No choice. So when we talk about South Shore and Pill Hill, that they were restricted. So there was a white community on Pill Hill, if you all know what I'm talking about, and there was a Black community, and the Black community could not purchase homes in Pill Hill until Shelley versus Kramer in 1948, which actually didn't really solve the problem. The problem was not really solved because realtors would go around to neighborhoods and sell homes as restricted, like right up until 1968 and probably even today, truth be told. So in 1968, we had the Fair Housing Act, which actually slammed the door on these laws so that people could then, you could take people to court for these racial restrictive covenants. Before that, it was a little bit fuzzy. So it's really important, I think. I love that you said that, John, but to always include that people who went to South suburbs or went to South Chicago or they had no choice.
Next week will be the last in this series. We will be hearing from Representative Cam Buckner, who is the state representative for this district. And his topic will be racism and the state budget. So we're going to expand our scope a bit, and we are delighted to welcome him next week. So I hope that many of you will be back. I want to give a distinct thank you to Justin and to Regan for all their work. I would say they're staying around, but some of us are making pilgrimage to the South Side this afternoon, actually down to First Presbyterian Church. And so we will need to be departing soon. And Regan and Justin are two of the ones going. So grab them quickly if you'd like to follow up with a question. Thank you all for being here.